Welcome to this special edition of Global Ocean Television, the official television channel of the world's ocean, brought to you by the TerraMar Project. I'm Ghislaine Maxwell of the TerraMar Project, and I could not be more excited today to have an interview with Ian Urbina. Ian is an investigative reporter with the New York Times, and today we'll be discussing his series of articles about the lawlessness of the high seas, called the Outlaw Ocean. For those that have not yet read these incredible articles, we'll be sure to include links and notes in this interview so that you can link back to his articles. In the Outlaw Ocean series, Ian reveals that crime and violence in the international waters often goes unpunished and recounts his first-hand experiences in some of the most unforgiving places on Earth. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ian. It really, really is a pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me.
As I did warn you, the burning question on everybody's lips before we get into the meat of your amazing articles is, how many times did you get seasick on this journey?
For whatever reason, I didn't get seasick at all. I think I have just an inner ear that doesn't lend itself to getting seasick. But on a bunch of the trips, the translator that was with us got very sick. And it became a factor on one trip because she was out of commission for the whole time.
Well, there'll be a lot of people watching this that will be very jealous of your inner ear right now. But seriously, how did you come to this ocean and this topic? It's quite an esoteric topic unless you actually live by the sea or work on the ocean. I would love to hear how this came to be from start to finish.
So about a decade ago, I was in a doctoral program, and I was fairly burnt out on my research and was looking for some way to clear my head. I took a job as an anthropologist on a ship for 3 months that was harbored in Singapore. And I had never been to sea, and I'd never really worked on a ship. And I was blown away by the people I met and this sort of strange tribe of seafarers that were right there, all around us, but and were so sort of distinct, but I had never come across. And so at the end of the 3 months, I had to go back to school, and I sort of vowed that I would get back out to that space.
And so when you were looking at the space, how did you come to choose the high seas as opposed to other, the ocean topics are, limitless really, so pollution and biology and entomology, but so how did the high seas, how did you settle on that as the topic that you were going to focus on?
I mean, initially I was really interested in taking a look at the high seas from a labor perspective and a human rights perspective. I felt like there was some, not enough, certainly, but some good reporting already out there on the environmental elements. But that the people who live and work out there, almost again as an anthropologist, were what first drew me. And I guess I wanted to approach it journalistically as an opportunity to take readers to a place that they wouldn't otherwise get to visit. And so the goal was to spend as much time offshore and get out as far as possible with these stories. And then sort of lastly, the goal was the notion of it not as a negative or pernicious place, but as a extra legal place, sort of beyond the reach. And in some ways, that's what I thought attracted people through the centuries. It was a way to escape governments and all the worries of landed life. Many people flee to the sea, and so I thought if we approach it as an outlaw space, an extra legal space, and just see what human consequences exist as a result of that outlaw status.
When you took this idea to the New York Times, how did you pitch it, and how did they approach it? When you took that, did they think you were crazy, or how did it go down?
I have a great editor. Her name is Rebecca Corbett, and she's a very serious sort. And we typically have a conversation toward the end of each year about what we might do for the next big project. And I tend to be ready for that conversation come late December, early January. And in this year, this was a year and a half ago, she sprung it on me about 2 months early. I was in her office and she said, "So what are you thinking about for your next project?" And I was woefully unprepared, and she's not the sort that sits well with, "I'll get back to you." And so I have harbored this idea of trying to get the Times to send me out to sea for years. And
Excellent.
it was sort of like the only thing that was in my back pocket. And I had, a couple of sentences that had, conceptually been there for a long time. One was, when you're an investigative reporter and your job is to sort of parachute around into topics, you always have to be careful about encroaching on other people's beats. And diplomatically, that's a thorny process. And so you're always looking for big topics, but also ones that have the potential for virgin snow, that are topically outside of other people's jurisdiction. So this topic enticed me because we don't have a beat reporter that, has command over that space. So we wouldn't run afoul of the foreign desk. We wouldn't get in trouble with the national desk. This was sort of just open space. And then just the sheer scope of it, I remember having mentioned to her that 2/3 of the planet is covered by water, and most of that space is, in my view, ungoverned and ungovernable in many ways. And so those two sentences alone struck me as kind of begging for further storytelling. And she agreed, and I was shocked, frankly. It's a really difficult and sprawling and expensive thing to take on. But she and Dean Baquet right away thought, let's give it a try.
So was that soup to nuts was 1 year when they sent you off? Is that took you a year from when she said yes, that sounds fantastic, go? It took you to the first story in print?
It was a year and a half. So that conversation happened about a year and a half, a little more than that now.
So talking about piracy, so I think we can all agree that it is a very lawless part of the world, for 45% of the planet, full of pirates and so on. But the tradition of pirates in the old days, certainly, they were really an adjunct of the government, certainly in England, so the pirates. Do you think, looking at the piracy that you see out there, are these pirates in cahoots with governments? Do you see any of that? Is this something like the old racketeers of past that are doing bidding in the open oceans for governments because they can't do that themselves? Is there any of that you see, like the old piracy of yore?
Pirates is this laden term now. I think a lot of average folk think of Captain Phillips now when they think of pirates, and so they think of Somali piracy, and that is such a small sliver of the reality, both historically and geographically. And so one of the big things that I had to kind of learn is that pirates, as we are, sort of armed thugs on the oceans, come in so many different shapes and forms. And so for the one story about violence, part of the point was to try to broaden the spectrum of categories. And I quickly also realized that what happens, say, in the Sundarbans or in the region around Bangladesh is very, very different than, say, the armed attacks that you'll find on the South China Sea, which is super different than what you'll find off the coast of Nigeria. And all of that's very different than Somalia, off the coast there. And they're different both in the sense of who's doing the attacking, how they attack, and who they're targeting. So to answer your question, I do think there's always going to be some sort of government role in every category here. From the smallest end, their role will be to look the other way and sort of tolerate it. To the more pronounced involvement, you have governments that actually sometimes are facilitating it. And I think an example of that is off the coast of Nigeria. There are a fair number of armed, organized militias that sometimes actually have active involvement from various competing coastal authorities, and they're getting kickbacks and the like.
I had some reports of that in Somalia, where they are using the ransom money to support warlords, local warlords, and the local government. Did you see a lot? So you did see some of that, obviously.
I did, yeah, I did. And obviously Somalia has so quieted down now that but exactly what you're describing, I think the new hotspot for that, at least along Africa, is along the Nigerian coast. In
one of your articles, you wrote that there's no mandatory reporting for crime or murders even at sea. How does that really work, and what does that really mean? Is that so literally there's no law at all, or it's just that because it's so far away people don't ask you to? I thought that murder would be sort of a universally necessary reporting straight into some authority. Or is it just that there's no law that covers that type of crime out in the high seas and other egregious crimes?
Yeah, so I mean, the thing that I thought, again, almost anthropologically, that was fascinating about the high seas is that the definition of laws are different than what you and I think of when we think of the nation state and on land. And at sea, there are these long-standing traditions and norms that eventually, many of them have been codified into laws, but there have been sort of maritime standards that existed for centuries, and they were somewhat enforced, somewhat self-imposed, and again, some of them have been written up as laws. And so, yeah, there are laws on the books that obviously murder is illegal. But the reporting issue goes back to kind of the fundamental of so much out there, which is that, to use a cliche, laws are only as good as their enforcement. And in terms of enforcing many of these laws, there really isn't a mechanism on the high seas. There are some places where you can really demonstrably show that enforcement does exist and it's robust. So, you know, you look at oil dumping and you look at how it's handled when ships come into U.S. ports. There's a fairly robust and aggressive tradition of the U.S. Coast Guard really going after ships for, fraudulent oil logs and the like, and they've arrested people and they've levied huge fines. But again, and same thing with fisheries management. There's lots going on in this realm. But when it comes to a guy going overboard or a rape on a fishing vessel in international waters or that level of crime, there is no real apparatus for reporting these things other than it's supposed to go to the flag state. And those are, as you well know and your audience knows, are largely for-profit companies. And their customers are the ships themselves, and they tend to be very small, sometimes even just P.O. box operations with no real interests, much less wherewithal to do investigations or seek prosecution.
So the purple notice, it seems extraordinary that there can be, I think you said there were 8 vessels that were the top of the purple notice, but I know many of the people who are watching the show know that 8 is really scratching the surface of illegal fishing vessels. And pretty much any vessel that switches its transponder off is probably up to no good at this point. So from overfishing and to illegal dumping, which you pointed out, and to my mind, it seems like an easy way to transport illegal arms, trafficking of all nations, slavery at sea, all these things. These are terrible and dangerous crimes. And I think overfishing is a crime. That's my point of view in that, because I think we all pay a heavy price for that, those fish being removed. So it seems extraordinary that nobody's really that interested. So Interpol, really only activated when there was an epic journey of yours to capture the thunder. But why aren't people more interested? Why are governments not more interested? Why do they not perceive or see the risk?
So this is speculative on my part, but my theory here is that this is at heart the so-called tragedy of the commons. This is sort of an off-spin of that, in the sense that the most intense crimes, the most systematic ones, if we're going to talk about illegal fishing, say, the syndicates, such as the Spaniard Vidal Armadores, there are real, robust, long-lasting, well-documented syndicates who make their career out of illegal fishing and make millions of dollars. Those players, and even the smaller ones, are predominantly committing their crimes in waters that really belong to no one and everyone. And when they do venture into waters like Camelar, in Antarctica, where there's supposed to be an authority, they usually are flagged. They're usually someone notifies that they're breaking the law, and they move on very quickly. And so the lack of follow-through is because there's no real interested party. There's a coalition of somewhat interested parties who might go as far as maybe blacklisting a vessel, but in terms of actually chasing them down and investigating and prosecuting, that's a really labor-intensive process, expensive, and many of the countries that might have a little bit of vested interest don't have the funds to chase that crime. And it's an international crime, so you'd be going up against a foreign entity, which gets very complicated very quickly. And oftentimes the big players, South Koreans, the Spaniards, these players are very well funded, and they have connections to the government, and so they can get themselves de-blacklisted, and they can pull the levers that they have access to.
So in the UN, in September, they're going to announce that the oceans have made one of the Sustainable Development Goals. I think it's number 14. And that's an international body that claims that, we're not sure what the language looks like yet, but to manage the oceans, the high seas specifically, should be sustainably managed. So given that you've seen so much, and that is going to now be passed as one of the goals, and with the knowledge that you have today, what do you think we, a community, and others who may be watching this that aren't as familiar as you are, what should we do? What do you think the answer is? Or do you have some pearls of wisdom to share with us?
No.
Oh no.
Next question. I mean, it's a nerve-wracking question in many ways.
I'm so sorry.
It always feels a little dodgy for a reporter to venture into prescription. So that makes me nervous because A, I don't feel expert enough, quite frankly, and B, it feels beyond the scope of my duties. What I can say, and this is not meant as a duck, but is that I think it's a very legitimate thing to ask a reporter this question, and I turn to sources, people that I think are really smart and have studied this far more than I have, and asked them. And the answers I got were all across the map, partially because the topics we covered ranged from human rights to labor to environmental abuses, and then even above those categories of abuse were sort of structural problems with how the whole thing is governed. The answers that came back were there was no single silver bullet. So for example, and a lot of these responses are in a couple of pieces that are at the bottom of our oceans page where we compiled their responses, but they range from, a good number of folks thought on the slave issue, on the indentured servitude on these boats issue, that there really is a lot of work that has to be done on supply chain transparency and accountability in general. And to some degree, that whole angle of pressure is one that focuses less on governments and more on large consumers as a block and producers, companies as a block. And the folks who push for supply chain transparency and accountability argue that some of them that transshipment in fishing, this habit of allowing boats to stay out at sea and the fish coming off of the boats and being transported back to shore is problem number one, because it is a jump in the supply chain that makes it virtually impossible to know where that fish came from and was it legally caught and what were the conditions on that vessel. So some have argued for requiring boats to come back more frequently to shore and requiring big producers like Thai Union and these big companies to truly wean themselves from transshipment. Anyway, but there's a whole range of other pressure points. Port state control really stepping up inspections that occur at ports. So that's a longer discussion.
Fair enough. All right. So then I just want to jump to two really last questions. So in this amazing piece of work that you did, and that I felt was so exciting. I couldn't put it down, and I'm hoping that you're going to turn it into a novel. Can we look forward to the Ian Urbina novel of the high seas, and then followed by the movie? Can we look forward to this?
I am thinking about a book.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so the second question I have then sort of relates somewhat to that. Is there any stories that you can share with us and the audience that you didn't have a space constraint for, just didn't fit within the narrative of the tale, that on any spectrum, as regards this amazing piece of work that you did, that it could be fun, it can just be serious, it could be anything, that you couldn't put into your articles that you can share with us?
And you're asking about stories that I pursued but didn't write, or that I really
as specifically relating to this series in the New York Times, about what did you not include, either because you couldn't, because there was a time constraint, or because it just didn't fit that particular narrative, but you stuck in your head, you're like, wow, I wish I could have written that, but your editor was like, Ian, are you kidding? No way. Boom, edited.
Well, one thing I should say is we may not be done. They're quite surprising to me, frankly, was more interest in this than I thought there was going to be. And so we're now thinking about possibly doing one or two additional stories, but that's still uncertain. So I'm reluctant to tip my hand on what might be the final one or two.
You have carte blanche, so it can be anything. So now we know you don't puke, but maybe there's some other detail that are interesting. It can be anything. There was no constraints. You had free reign here.
I think.
You're not looking to divulge anything.
I think moments that I will take with me, into my older years. There certainly was one of the most daunting moments in the reporting was the effort to get with Selassie Kobe was a photographer an African photographer that joined me, and we wanted to get on the chase of the Thunder. And the logistical challenge of catching up with those guys were potentially the hardest thing in the whole series. And we had essentially 48 hours to get a couple hundred miles offshore to a very specific rendezvous point by a certain, and they were not going to wait for us. They said, we'll wait an hour, and then we've got to go back and join the chase, because the bad guys could peel off, and we might not be able to catch up with them. Anyway, so I flew into the country and essentially had no ride in place. And that was 48 hours of pure panic in lining up a way to get out to sea. And I'll just say the first attempt to get out there was a debacle, and there was a near mutiny on the way out there of the crew because the ship that was taking us was not built to go that far out to sea.
I have a question. Did you have life jackets on? Was safety part of this plan?
I'm not going to answer that question.
My
lawyer has advised me to answer no such questions. And my wife, for that matter. There are no photographs indicating how safe we were or weren't. So, but anyway, the best stories were, I think, the most daunting. We headed back, and on the way back, they lost all power to the ship, and so we were lost at sea for 5-6 hours. And that was a moment where I thought, is this how it's going to end? You know, this is a really unflattering way to go. You know, in the middle of the sea, we could not figure out where we were going. But anyway, we made it back.
Well, we're very happy about that. So, can I just, are you going to be focusing, so, you know, follow the money is always one of those great lines, especially for a journalist, especially when you want to, and there's so much illegal activity around this. Is this a case of maybe follow the money, or is it follow the fish?
Yeah.
So I think this is a phenomenal topic. I mean, it covers, and by the way, whilst you say it doesn't belong to anyone, actually, as you know, the TerraMar Project believes it belongs to us, all of us, and we give a passport to those people who want to claim their peace or feel connected to the high seas. And it's our job to take that and make it relevant to our lives, and your stories have done that. So are we going to be able to see, I'm thrilled to know there may be 2 others, but are you going to take maybe another aspect of this? Is that a possibility? When you talk to your editor in December, is it follow, are you planning? And
yeah, I would certainly, I do think there's really good reporting to be done, like you say, on following the fish, and all the way back to individual markets here in the U.S. I think that's the way to make stories resonate, you know, and to some degree that's what the pet food story sought to do. But there's a lot more in that category, I think.
So the real price of the tuna that you eat, or the Dover sole that you eat, for those who aren't familiar, what do you think? So let's say a tuna you can have on their plate for an expensive one, so $18, very nice little tuna tartare or whatever. What do you think the real cost of that is for the person who's ordering that?
Oh, wow. Yeah, I have no idea. It's certainly way more than what we're paying. I do think, you know, these prices are artificially low because we're not accounting for all these hidden, you know, costs that eventually will catch up with us. I mean, when the tuna's all gone and the seas are polluted, we'll all pay the price then.
Indeed. Well, Ian, it has been such a phenomenal pleasure to have you. I want to thank you so much for your time. Cannot wait for the rest of your stories to come out, and the novel, and the movie, and whatever else you have up your sleeve. And from us at TerraMar, and for all the people who are watching, thank you very, very, very much indeed for your time, and we look forward to being able to maybe do this again and following up with all your amazing work.
Great. Well, thank you.
All right. It's lovely to see you.